Welcome to this week's Gramophone Podcast. I'm Martin Cullingford, editor of Gramophone, and today I'm joined by the composer John Pickard to talk about his new album on the Bis label, a selection of works including his Mass in Troubled Times. This week's podcast is brought to you in association with Stage Plus, the new streaming service from Deutsche Grammophon, which offers weekly live stream videos of concerts from around the world, as well as an archive of over 400 concerts to enjoy on demand, plus documentaries, audio albums, interviews, and much more. And currently, every user who buys an annual subscription gets a deluxe edition of Daniel Trifonov's Bach the Art of Life as a physical present as well. Visit stage-plus.com or download the Stage Plus iOS app. I hope you enjoy the podcast. John Pickard, hello. Lovely to talk to you today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, we're here today to specifically explore your fascinating new album, featuring as it does the world premiere recording of your Mass in Troubled Times. It was composed in 2018, but as you write in the booklet notes that despite some key core moments in your compositional career, including your Opus 1, it's an area that's played a smaller role in your work than perhaps your orchestral and chamber work. And yet this album actually takes us towards the Mass in a way, featuring 5 short Latin motets that span your career, spread as they are from 1983 through to 2015, and also other works too. So perhaps let's in fact begin there, the development of your choral voice, as it were.
I think that for me, choral composition is something that's kind of happened by accident. It's happened in dribs and drabs. And it's rather strange because, I studied in an institution that had a strong choral tradition. I've taught for years in one that has plenty of high-quality choirs. I conduct a choir myself. But it's never been a central part of my creativity until really more recently. And I really can't account for that. So the pieces that make up the album have been sort of assembled over the years, and some of them are little occasional pieces, and some, as you say, that the Mass is the main work on this album, and I wasn't at all sure how we would order the music on the album, because I'm still quite keen on the idea of a physical CD that is curated and has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And of course, that's not how many people consume their music now, but it remains important to me. And I originally thought we would start with the Mass, but Robert von Bahr, who is the founder and owner of Bis Records, was absolutely adamant that the disc had to end with the Mass, and I think that's absolutely right. I think it's the right decision. The rhythm feels right from the disc.
Yeah, and so the pieces that you had written prior to the Mass, did they tend to come from commissions for particular events you were asked to write for?
Yes, I would say pretty much without exception. I suppose the only exception was the very first piece, Ozymandias, which I consider to be my Opus 1. I was 19 when I wrote it, and it was one of my weekly composition exercises. I just happened to write that piece, and it seemed to work well. And it was performed by the university singers, a chamber choir at the university where I studied, which was Bangor. So it had its start in life 40 years ago.
So here we are, the Mass in Troubled Times, a really ambitious work, both in size but style too. So how did that come about? What was the origins of this commission?
So the starting point for that was the opportunity to write a piece for the BBC Singers. And of course, which composer would not wish to do that? They can sing absolutely anything. If a human voice can do it, they can sing it. So I knew that I could write something on an ambitious scale. And I'd already worked with the poet Gavin da Costa, who is also a professor of Catholic theology in the same university where I work, University of Bristol. And we worked together on one collaboration, which was a sort of a kind of a chamber cantata for mezzo-soprano and about 6 instruments. And that seemed to go well. We enjoyed working together, and we agreed that if the opportunity came up to work on another piece, we would do so. So when this came up, I spoke to Gavin and said that it had been on my mind to try and write something that connected with the structure of the Mass. I wasn't sure how, but I had this idea of a Mass in time of war, a reference to Haydn, of course. And he was very interested in this, but was immediately resistant to the idea of calling it Mass in time of war. And I think quite rightly so. It limits the subject matter, and so we set aside the idea that the title, and began to think about how we might structure the whole work and make it in some way relevant and contemporary. He just went away and started writing, and I knew no more about it until the email arrived with the text. And at that point, well, it was a mixture of excitement and, well, a sharp intake of breath from me. And I looked at some of the things, thought, how on earth am I going to set this? But I did. We hardly changed a thing. And it really was an extraordinarily exciting thing to do, and it pushed me in different directions.
Which explains, so there's parts of the Latin Mass Ordinary, there's text in Arabic, there's poetry about a narrative of refugees escaping by sea of father and daughter, and collectively they create this work of pleading, of hope, of recognition. I mean, how would you describe? You said you had a sharp intake of breath. What when you received that text, did you think this work is saying to me?
What was it saying to me? Well, it was saying to me that there were different layers of narrative, and it immediately made me think of how was I going to be dividing up the choir? How was I going to articulate the different layers and keep some sense of continuity? Take these very diverse elements, because it's a polyglot text. I think it's 5 languages. How was I going to draw those together into a single unified whole, whilst respecting the differences? And this is very important, because we're dealing not just with a Western tradition, but with the Middle Eastern world, and I wanted to treat that with respect. There are some passages from the Quran in Arabic. There's a passage from the Old Syriac liturgy, which Gavin has used in very specific ways, and so I had to think about how was I going to practically handle this. I'm a very practical composer. My immediate thought is, how do I deal with this? How do I make this work? How do I make the piece singable? How do I articulate the whole structure in a way that is comprehensible? So that was one of the main challenges. And then, how do you deal with the language? I mean, who speaks Old Syriac? Well, the answer is a man called Sebastian Brock, who is retired now. It's at Oxford University. So I had to do my homework, and I went off to see him and took a recorder with me, and he gave me a lesson in how to pronounce the text, and I made sure I knew exactly how to do it. Similarly with the Arabic, I made sure I had somebody to work with me and teach me exactly the inflections. Turkish was less of a problem. I had a colleague who was Turkish, but again went through it with me. So I had to really absorb these sections so that I knew what the language would sound like, and then that gave me the ideas for how to create the music around that.
And you've talked about the practicalities of the linguistics, getting that right, but then you also alluded to the sensitivities of dealing with things from different cultural backgrounds and the way you've set those different aspects. So, for example, the Latin words, the way you've set those sort of echo to my ears the way that perhaps they might have been set in the old church tradition. When it comes to setting the poetry, there's a sort of a clarity there, but also when you're setting some of the Middle Eastern texts, you're sort of alluding there as well to the sound world of those culturally. I mean, so tell me about that process.
Yeah. So to take the Latin, first of all, obviously we have this rich tradition stretching back over 1,000 years, and a polyphonic tradition of almost 1,000 years. And I wanted to take a very broad view of that. So a lot of the Latin is set polyphonically. And some of the time it's in a language that is almost Renaissance polyphony. There's one passage in particular where it divides into I think it's about 13 parts, and it has the sort of modality of I suppose Tudor polyphony. Might have been what I had in mind, but it's not quite that. It's sort of it's a kind of a middle world between contemporary music and the music of the Renaissance. Then there are passages that are much more chromatic. Much more tortured, and then there's one passage at the beginning of the Sanctus, really of you might almost call it micropolyphony of the ligeti variety, where I'm writing for 18 solo voices in this piece, and it divides into 18 real parts. So I was trying to take all sorts of different kinds of approaches to polyphony. Sometimes it's strictly canonic, so other times it's more flexible. So in one sense, that was quite easy to do because I had a kind of a context for that. The narrative poem, as you mentioned, the important thing to me there was to get the words through, to tell the story. So quite often the writing there is homophonic and it's chordal. Even though the chords are often very complex, the clarity of the text is of crucial importance there. Then when it comes to the Middle Eastern material, that was where one had to tread with care. In terms of the material from the Quran. I studied carefully some examples of Tawhid, of the recitation of the passages, and I homed in on those particular passages and developed my writing from there. The old Syriac material that just had to be entirely of my own invention. There was no tradition that I could work with there. But going back to practical issues, one thing that was immediately apparent to me was that if I tried to make all the singers sing in that language, it was going to be very problematic. So I isolated one voice. It's a solo alto who sings this. And because, again, understanding is very important to me, and this is essentially an obsolete language, I decided to have a parallel translation going on, if you like, which is sung by the rest of the choir. So as you hear the alto solo, the rest of the choir is translating what she sings. And this was not the original intention of my librettist, Gavin. He put the English translation there as part of his poem, but he hadn't envisaged that I would actually set it. And he was quite surprised when I did that, and then said, "Oh, actually, yeah, it makes sense. I can see that working," and I think he was quite happy with that. There was a lot of to and fro in our in our working. We were very open to each other's ideas. There was just one moment where I asked him to add some text. There's a long section in the middle, in the credo, which is a depiction of the journey of the father and daughter across the sea, and it's a kind of a nightscape. And that was the moment where I felt the music needed to expand. Lyrically, we needed this point of calm in the music, and I said to him, "Look, I need some more words. Can you give me some more, another stanza?" And he said, "Yeah, no problem." And we had another stanza. And this is, of course, a tremendous luxury, because if you're setting an existing poem by a dead poet, you can't do that. You can't phone them up and say, "Give me another stanza." So it's one of the joys of working with a living writer, especially somebody as cooperative and helpful as Gavin. I should add that.
And when we're listening to this, it occurs to me that only 500 years or so ago, the musical relationship between countries around the Mediterranean, Europe, the Middle East, would have been much more fluid. Musicians working in the Iberian Peninsula and from North Africa than perhaps it is now. And is that something that was there in your mind when drawing these worlds together?
I suppose it was in some sort of residual way, because coming from the academic background that I do, the day job, I occupy an office at work next door to probably the leading scholar in the world on old Hispanic chant, Professor Emma Hornby. And in fact, it was as part of one of her projects that Gavin da Costa and I worked together on our first piece. So Emma's research is something that I encounter literally on a daily basis. I mean, I don't understand everything that she's doing, but I sort of imbibe this, and we've talked quite frequently about the work that she does. So that idea of, as you said, the Iberian Peninsula and the influences that were coming in that direction, and the changes that were happening, is something I'm certainly conscious of. And I suppose you're right. It probably got into the into the music. If it hadn't been for her, this piece probably wouldn't have happened.
No, it's interesting. And just the sort of sheer virtuosity that you were able to draw from the BBC singers, more than ever before over the last year or so. I think the wider world's become aware of just what an extraordinary group they are. Tell me what it's like writing for a group like that, and how writing for them informs what you know that you can do.
It's the most extraordinary privilege to write for a group like the BBC Singers. I don't think there's a finer chamber choir in the world. Certainly not one that has the sheer virtuosity, not just virtuosity, but sheer breadth that they have. As I said earlier, they can sing anything, and the flexibility with which they approach things, not just the vocal virtuosity, but the way that they can find their way into different styles is quite remarkable. I have to admit, before the first rehearsal of this piece, I was terribly nervous. Most of the time I'm pretty sanguine about what I do. I usually know what's going to happen before I go into a rehearsal. I feel that I pretty much know what I'm doing, but in this case I really didn't. And I was looking at the score a couple of days before the first rehearsal, before the premiere, and I thought, my goodness, I think I may have crossed the line here. I may have done something that is really just too difficult to sing. And I didn't go to the first rehearsal. I just let them get on with it. And the conductor of the premiere, Andrew Griffiths, contacted me straight after the rehearsal and said, it's all absolutely fine. They can sing it perfectly well, and I think you'll be very happy when you come tomorrow. So that was like an enormous load off my mind. And just as an example of the virtuosity of this choir, there was one moment in the rehearsal where they sit down to rehearse. They each have a music stand, so they're more like orchestral musicians really than a traditional choir as we might understand it. And although they often work with an accompanist, the accompanist is very judicious in the kind of support that they give. They're not just bashing out the notes. So there was one point where they were going to go from a certain passage, and it was a very dense, complex chord, maybe 10 different notes, something like that. And somebody said, "Can we have an A, please?" And the pianist just gave an A, and bang, the chord was there. Absolutely perfect, perfectly in tune. And I looked at the score, and one of the few notes that was missing from that chord was an A. They just used the A as a reference note so that each singer could pitch the interval from the A, and it just happened. And it's quite eerie. I've never encountered that with a choir before.
That's an extraordinary example of what they can do and what you've asked of them. Now, this is a very moving, powerful work, but thematic subjects are not uncommon for you, as well as obviously your symphonies, your chamber work. From depicting conflict, loss to the sunset from the International Space Station. Tell me about the choosing of subjects and the way that a subject informs the music you write, as opposed to when you're writing for want of a better word, more abstract way.
It's often the thing that will initially stimulate the piece, and the main thing for me that an extra musical subject gives me is a sense of structure for the piece. When you're writing quite extended works, which is generally what I do, there are obviously miniature pieces on this disc, but most of the pieces that I write are longer forms, and they can take quite a while to write. They can take weeks, months, even in some cases years. And you need something to kind of get you through. You need something to make sure that every day when you're writing the work, you're writing the same piece. You're not writing some other piece. So having some kind of narrative, even if it's not something that you ultimately reveal, can be a very valuable thing, just in knowing where you are. And it may be that when you get to the end, the piece you've written is actually an abstract piece, and you don't feel any need to share whatever might have helped you. And it need not be a very personal thing, just some way of projecting your ideas onto a structure. So that's one way of working. Another way of working is that you are just dealing with the notes, and as you work, something outside of the music begins to emerge. I can give you an example of this. My most recent symphony, which number 6, which we recorded earlier this year, and it'll be coming out on BIS Records next year. I wrote that during the pandemic. I wrote it during the, I think it must have been the 3rd lockdown. It was in early 2021. So it was after Christmas, and we knew we were going into a lockdown. And it was at just that point when I started writing symphony. And the thing to understand is that with almost everything I write, I start at the beginning and go through to the end. If I get stuck at bar 72, I can't write bar 73. I have to retrace my steps until I find what's gone wrong, and then I have to rewrite, and it's only then that I can carry on. It's an absolutely linear approach to an annoying degree for me. I can't just slot things in. So as I was writing that piece, I really had no idea where I was going with the work, to an extreme degree. From one bar to another, I didn't know what was going to happen, and I was quite comfortable with that. And it was only after I completed the piece that I realized that the experience that we were all going through had informed the music. That's not to say that it's a pandemic symphony. It's absolutely not. And that is not going to be that's not what the piece is about, but it is what informed the overall shape of the work. And how could it not? something as shattering as that, and something as universal, how could it not somehow get into what I did? So I know it's there, but I may not be able to articulate precisely how it manifests itself, but I know it's there.
And just finally, on this album, there are 2 instrumental works, one for solo trumpet and organ, one for solo organ. Tell me about their placement on this album and how they relate to the wider works.
Well, it's quite funny because those 2 pieces involve the organ, and none of the choral pieces do. It's a bit perverse, really, when you think about it. So there are 2 pieces that I've written. These are the 2 pieces that involve the organ, and the first one's a solo organ piece called Tesserae, which I wrote for David Good in about 2008 or 9, something like that, and he's performed it a few times. And again, it was one of these things where you know you're writing for somebody who is such a brilliant player that you can do anything. So I wanted to write a virtuosic piece for him. Now, I'm not a big fan of the sort of the romantic organ. I'm not a fan of the sort of organ symphonies of the late 19th century. It's just not my kind of thing, but I do quite like, very much like Barocco organ music, and I like the clarity, and I like the formality, and I like the breaking up of individual sounds that the organ can produce, because to me the organ is always a mechanical instrument. It's not a pseudo orchestral instrument. It's a machine. and I quite like that. So I wanted to exploit that in Tesserae and break the material up. So you have discrete chunks of ideas with different colours and different harmonies, and then I rearrange them as the piece goes on, and certain types of music cluster together. They arrange themselves in clumps as the piece progresses, and so a sense of continuity begins to emerge, I hope. So that was what lay behind that piece, and the tesserae are the individual fragments in a mosaic. Now with Orion, that's a different piece. That's for trumpet and organ, and I was commissioned to do that. That was for the Prestine Festival, and so that was quite an exciting combination to write for, because you've got the machine and the organ and a very human sound to me of the trumpet, maybe even an angelic trumpet, and that made me think of space and the heavens, and that led me to the subject of Orion. And I've always been very interested in astronomy, and a number of my pieces have associations with astronomy. So I produced what is, I suppose, a kind of a sonata for trumpet and organ, dealing with three different aspects of Orion, mythologically and astronomically. So we start with a depiction, I suppose, or a response to the idea of the Orion Nebula. The music starts from a distance and gradually emerges into clarity. And at the very end of the piece, there is a final kind of explosion, and the music disappears into the distance, and the trumpeter literally disappears into the distance. It gets further and further away into the space until the sound disappears.
Yeah, well, it's a beautiful work, beautifully recorded, as indeed is the whole album. So Mass in Troubled Times, performed by the BBC singers Martin Brebbins, along with other works, all written by my guest today, John Pickard, is available now on the BIS label. John Pickard, thank you for joining me today and talking me through the album.
Thank you, it's been a great pleasure.
An excerpt from John Pickard's Orion for Trumpet and Organ, taken from his new album on BIS, Mass in Troubled Times. And my thanks to John Pickard for joining me today. This week's podcast was brought to you in association with Stage Plus, the new streaming service from Deutsche Gramophone, which offers weekly live stream videos of concerts from around the world, as well as an archive of over 400 concerts to enjoy on demand, plus documentaries, audio albums, interviews and much more. And currently, every user who buys an annual subscription gets a deluxe edition of Daniel Trifonov's Bach, The Art of Life as a physical present due. Visit stage-plus.com or download the Stage Plus iOS app. And thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we'd be hugely grateful if you could leave a rating or a review, hit the subscribe button, or simply tell your friends about our work. And if you want to explore classical music in even greater depth with Gramophone, then we produce a monthly magazine packed full of interviews, features and reviews. And all listeners to this podcast can get a 20% discount by visiting gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and entering podcast 20 at the checkout. And do join us again for another Gramophone podcast next week.